In the archives of the Iowa State Historical Society, photographic historian Dr. Helen Morrison was cataloging a collection of 19th century family portraits when she discovered an image that would lead her into one of the most poignant mysteries of Victorian-era photography. The portrait, dated September 1878, showed three children from what appeared to be a prosperous farming family, posed in the formal manner typical of rural American photography of that era. The children, identified on the photograph's backing as the Whitman children, Mary, age 12, Samuel, age 9, and little Emma, age 6, September 15th, 1878, were arranged in a classic sibling composition. Mary, the eldest, stood behind her younger siblings with a protective hand on Samuel's shoulder. Samuel sat in the center, his serious expression reflecting the solemnity expected of children during long photographic exposures. Little Emma, the youngest, was positioned slightly to the side, her small hands folded neatly in her lap. The setting appeared to be the front parlor of a well-appointed farmhouse, with lace curtains visible in the background and what looked like the family's best furniture arranged to create an appropriate backdrop. The children were dressed in their finest clothing. Mary in a dark wool dress with white lace collar, Samuel in a formal suit with short pants, and Emma in a white dress with intricate embroidery that suggested the family's comfortable financial circumstances. At first glance, the portrait seemed unremarkable, representing the kind of formal family documentation that was becoming increasingly common as photography became more accessible to rural American families. However, as Dr. Morrison examined the image more closely, she began to notice subtle details that seemed inconsistent with a typical family portrait. The lighting in the photograph appeared uneven, with one of the children seeming to be illuminated differently than the others. More puzzling was the positioning of the children themselves. While Mary and Samuel appeared naturally posed, Emma's position seemed somehow artificial, as if she'd been carefully arranged rather than simply posed. Her expression, unlike her siblings, showed no signs of the slight movement blur that was common in children's portraits, due to the long exposure times required by 1878 photography technology. Most intriguingly, Emma appeared to be extraordinarily still and peaceful, almost unnaturally so for a 6-year-old child who would have had to remain motionless for the several minutes required for a proper exposure. Her eyes, while open and directed toward the camera, had a quality that Dr. Morrison found difficult to define, but deeply unsettling. The photograph's backing contained additional information that made Dr. Morrison pause. In loving memory of our dear children, the Whitman family, Cedar County, Iowa. The phrase "in loving memory" was commonly associated with memorial photography, yet all three children appeared to be alive and well in the image. To understand the significance of the unusual elements she had observed in the Whitman family portrait, Dr. Morrison immersed herself in research about photographic practices and family traditions in rural Iowa during the 1870s. What she discovered revealed a world where death was a constant presence, and families developed elaborate rituals to preserve memories of lost loved ones. Rural Iowa in 1878 represented the heart of America's agricultural expansion, where farming families had established thriving communities across the fertile prairie lands. However, life on these farms was also marked by significant hardships, including limited access to medical care, harsh weather conditions, and the constant threat of diseases that could devastate entire families, particularly affecting the most vulnerable members, children and the elderly. Infant and child mortality rates in rural America during the 1870s were staggeringly high by modern standards, with approximately 1 in 4 children dying before reaching their 5th birthday. Common killers included diphtheria, scarlet fever, typhoid, and whooping cough, diseases that spread rapidly through communities and against which there were few effective treatments. These harsh realities had led farming families to develop coping mechanisms that might seem unusual to modern observers, but were considered normal and necessary parts of 19th century family life. One of the most important of these traditions was the creation of memorial portraits that would preserve the memory of deceased family members for future generations. Dr. Morrison's research revealed that post-mortem photography had become an established practice in rural America by the 1870s, representing often the only opportunity for families to obtain a photograph of a deceased loved one. Professional. Photographers would travel from town to town, offering services that included not only portraits of living family members, but also memorial photographs that could be taken hours or even days after death. The techniques used in post-mortem photography were sophisticated and designed to create images where deceased subjects appeared peaceful and lifelike. Photographers used specialized poses, careful lighting, and sometimes even painting techniques to add color to the subject's cheeks and lips, creating the illusion of sleep rather than death. What made the Whitman portrait particularly intriguing was that it appeared to combine both living and deceased subjects in a single image, a practice that was technically challenging but not unknown in 1878. Such composite portraits required advanced photographic techniques and considerable skill to create convincing results, that would provide comfort to grieving families. Dr. Morrison consulted with Dr. James Peterson, a specialist in 19th century photographic techniques, to understand how photographers of the 1870s could have created a portrait that included both living and deceased subjects. What they discovered revealed the remarkable skill and compassion of Victorian-era photographers who served grieving families. The creation of composite memorial portraits required a combination of technical expertise and artistic sensitivity that represented the highest level of photographic craftsmanship available in 1878. Photographers who specialized in this work had developed techniques that could seamlessly blend images taken at different times or under different circumstances to create a single portrait that appeared completely natural. The most common method involved the use of multiple glass plate negatives that could be combined during the printing process. A skilled photographer could take a portrait of living family members, then carefully incorporate an image of a deceased loved one that had been photographed separately, adjusting lighting, positioning, and scale to create a convincing composite. In the case of postmortem subjects, photographers had developed specialized techniques for posing and lighting deceased individuals to create the most lifelike appearance possible. Bodies would be carefully positioned using hidden supports. Eyes would sometimes be painted open on the finished photograph, and clothing would be arranged to suggest natural relaxation rather than the rigidity of death. Dr. Peterson's analysis of the Whitman portrait revealed several technical clues that suggested the use of composite photography techniques. The lighting on Emma appeared to come from a slightly different angle than that illuminating her siblings, and the depth of field around her figure was subtly different from the rest of the image. Most significantly, Emma's extraordinary stillness, which Dr. Morrison had initially found puzzling, was actually characteristic of post-mortem photography subjects, who, unlike living children, could maintain perfect poses for the extended exposure times required by 1878 camera technology. The photographer who created the Whitman portrait had demonstrated exceptional skill in blending the two images, creating a seamless composition that would have provided immense comfort to the grieving family. The result was a portrait where all three Whitman children appeared to be together, allowing the family to preserve the memory of their complete family unit despite the tragedy that had befallen them. This discovery transformed Dr. Morrison's understanding of the photograph from a simple family portrait into a sophisticated work of memorial art that represented the intersection of technical innovation, artistic skill, and profound human compassion. With the understanding that the Whitman portrait likely included a post-mortem photograph of young Emma, Dr. Morrison began investigating historical records to uncover the circumstances of the child's death and the family's decision to create this elaborate memorial portrait. Her search would reveal a tragedy that was all too common in rural American families of the 1870s. Cedar County, Iowa, where the Whitman family had lived, maintained detailed vital records that provided Dr. Morrison with crucial information about the family's history. The 1870 census showed the Whitman household consisting of Father Jonathan Whitman, age 45, Mother Sarah Whitman, age 38, and their children Mary, Samuel, and Emma, along with Jonathan's elderly father who helped work the family's 160-acre farm. Property records indicated that Jonathan had established his farm in 1865, shortly after returning from service in the Civil War. The family had apparently prospered, gradually expanding their land holdings and building a substantial two-story farmhouse that was considered one of the finest residences in their township. However, Dr. Morrison's investigation also revealed the tragedy that had struck the Whitman family in the summer of 1878. Death records from the Cedar County Courthouse showed that Emma Whitman had died on August 23, 1878, at the age of 6 years and 4 months. The cause of death was listed as fever, a common designation for various illnesses that medical science of the era could not precisely identify or treat. Further research into local newspaper archives provided additional details about Emma's illness and death. The Cedar Rapids Gazette had published a brief notice stating, "The community mourns the loss of little Emma Whitman, beloved daughter of Jonathan and Sarah Whitman of Liberty Township, who passed to her eternal rest after a brief but severe illness. The child was known for her sweet disposition and bright intelligence." Dr. Morrison also discovered that Emma's death had occurred during a particularly difficult period for Cedar County families. The summer of 1878 had seen an outbreak of what local doctors called summer fever, likely a form of typhoid or dysentery, that had claimed the lives of several children in the area. Limited medical knowledge and the isolation of rural families had made it difficult to prevent the spread of such diseases. The timing of Emma's death in late August, followed by the creation of the memorial portrait in mid-September, suggested that the Whitman family had made the decision to commission the composite photograph as part of their mourning process. This would have been an expensive undertaking for a farming family, indicating the depth of their grief and their desire to preserve Emma's memory alongside her living siblings. Dr. Morrison's investigation into the creation of the Whitman Memorial portrait led her to discover the identity of the photographer responsible for this remarkable work. Albert Miller, a German immigrant who had established himself as one of Iowa's most skilled practitioners of memorial photography during the 1870s. Muller had arrived in Iowa in 1867, bringing with him photographic training he had received in Germany and a deep understanding of the technical challenges involved in post-mortem photography. Unlike many traveling photographers who offered memorial services as a sideline to their regular portrait work, Muller had developed a specialized practice that focused primarily on helping grieving families preserve memories of deceased loved ones. Records from Muller's photography business, preserved in the State Historical Society archives, revealed that he had developed an extensive network throughout eastern Iowa, with local undertakers and clergy referring bereaved families to his services. His reputation for sensitivity and technical excellence had made him the photographer of choice for families facing the loss of children. Miller's business ledger contained detailed records of his work with the Whitman family, providing Dr. Morrison with unprecedented insight into the creation of their memorial portrait. The entries showed that Muller had first visited the Whitman farm on August 24, 1878, just one day after Emma's death, to photograph the deceased child, according to the elaborate post-mortem photography protocols of the era. The technical notes in Muller's ledger revealed the care and expertise that went into photographing Emma. He had used a combination of natural and artificial lighting to create the most lifelike appearance possible, and had employed specialized posing techniques that would allow Emma's image to be seamlessly integrated with a later portrait of her living siblings. 3 weeks later, on September 15, 1878, Muller had returned to the Whitman farm to photograph Mary and Samuel in poses that would complement Emma's earlier portrait. His notes indicated that he had spent considerable time ensuring that the lighting, scale, and positioning of the living children would match Emma's image when the composite portrait was created. The creation of the final composite image had required Muller to return to his studio in Cedar Rapids, where he had access to the specialized printing equipment necessary to combine the multiple negatives into a single, seamless portrait. His ledger indicated that the entire process, from Emma's post-mortem photograph to the delivery of the finished memorial portrait, had taken nearly a month to complete. The cost of Muller's services, $25, equivalent to nearly $600 in today's currency, represented a significant expense for a farming family, but the Whitmans had apparently considered it a necessary investment in preserving their daughter's memory and maintaining their family's unity even in death. Dr. Morrison's research into the circumstances surrounding Emma Whitman's death revealed that her tragedy was part of a larger pattern of child mortality that had devastated the Cedar County farming community. During the summer of 1878, the investigation into this broader context provided crucial insights into why families like the Whitmans invested in elaborate memorial portraits during times of widespread loss. Local church records from the Liberty Township Methodist Church, where the Whitman family were active members, documented a heartbreaking series of child deaths that had occurred between July and September 1878. Pastor David Williams had recorded in his journal the loss of 11 children, ranging in age from 6 months to 12 years, all victims of what he described as the fever that has brought such sorrow to our community. The epidemic that claimed Emma's life had apparently begun in late June 1878, possibly introduced by travelers passing through the area or by contaminated water sources during an unusually hot and dry summer. Without understanding of germ theory or effective treatments for infectious diseases, the farming families of Cedar County had been helpless to prevent the spread of illness among their children. Dr. Morrison discovered that the community's response to this tragedy had included not only collective grieving but also mutual support for families facing the enormous expense of memorial photography and funeral services. Church records indicated that community members had contributed to a fund that helped families like the Whitmans afford the services of photographers like Albert Miller. The creation of elaborate memorial portraits during this period served multiple purposes beyond simple remembrance. In communities where child death was common, these photographs provided evidence that each lost child had been valued and mourned, serving as a form of social validation of the family's grief and the child's importance to the community. The portraits also served practical purposes in an era before widespread literacy, providing visual records that could be passed down through generations and shared with distant relatives who might never have met the deceased children. For families like the Whitmans, who had relatives in other states, the memorial portrait would serve as the primary way of introducing Emma to future family members. Most importantly, composite portraits that showed deceased children alongside their living siblings helped families maintain a sense of completeness and continuity despite their loss. Rather than removing all traces of Emma from their family records, the Whitmans had chosen to preserve her place within the family structure, ensuring that future generations would understand that they had been part of a family of 3 children, not 2. This community approach to grieving and memorial creation helped explain why families were willing to invest significant resources in elaborate photographic tributes during times of economic hardship and widespread loss. Dr. Morrison's investigation into the 1878 Cedar County epidemic that claimed Emma Whitman's life led her to consult with Dr. Sarah Martinez, a specialist in historical epidemiology, to understand what disease had actually caused the deaths of so many children that summer. The research revealed a pattern of illness that was tragically common in 19th century rural America. Analysis of death records, doctor's notes, and contemporary newspaper accounts suggested that the Cedar County epidemic was most likely an outbreak of typhoid fever, a bacterial infection spread through contaminated water and food sources. The timing of the outbreak during the hot, dry summer of 1878, combined with the symptom descriptions recorded by local physicians, was consistent with typhoid's typical patterns. Dr. Martinez explained that typhoid fever was particularly devastating to children because their developing immune systems were less capable of fighting the infection. The disease typically began with high fever, headache, and weakness, then progressed to more severe complications, including delirium, severe abdominal distress, and in many cases, death. The rural setting of Cedar County had made the epidemic particularly difficult to control. Many farming families relied on wells and cisterns that could easily become contaminated by surface runoff or improper waste disposal. The bacterial agent that causes typhoid could survive for weeks in water sources, allowing the disease to spread throughout entire communities before anyone understood the cause. Contemporary medical records from Dr. Edmund Harrison, the only physician serving the Liberty Township area in 1878, provided details about the epidemic's progression and the medical community's helplessness in treating the disease. Dr. Harrison's notes, preserved in the Iowa Medical Society archives, documented his futile attempts to treat the sick children with the limited remedies available at the time. The treatments Dr. Harrison had employed, including cold baths, purgatives, and various patent medicines, were not only ineffective, but may have actually worsened the children's conditions by causing further dehydration and stress to their already compromised systems. The medical understanding of infectious disease in 1878 was still decades away from recognizing the bacterial nature of typhoid fever. Dr. Harrison's notes about Emma Whitman's case indicated that she had been ill for approximately 2 weeks before her death, experiencing the classic typhoid symptoms of persistent high fever, severe headache, and abdominal distress. Despite the family's efforts to care for her and Dr. Harrison's attempts at treatment, Emma had succumbed to the disease on August 23, 1878. The epidemic had finally ended with the arrival of cooler weather in late September 1878, likely due to the natural die-off of the bacterial. Contamination in water sources and the reduced opportunities for transmission as families spent less time sharing common water sources. The creation of the Whitman family. Memorial portrait represented more than just a photographic technique. It embodied the Victorian era's complex relationship with death, memory, and the preservation of family bonds that transcended mortality. Dr. Morrison's investigation revealed how families like the Whitmans used memorial photography to maintain emotional connections with deceased, loved ones. In the context of 1878 rural Iowa, where death was an omnipresent reality, families had developed sophisticated strategies for integrating loss into their ongoing family narratives. The decision to create a composite portrait showing Emma alongside her living siblings represented a deliberate choice to maintain her position within the family structure, rather than treating her death as a complete separation. The technical expertise required to create such portraits meant that they were typically commissioned only for children whose deaths had particularly traumatic impact on their families. Emma's portrait suggested that she had held a special place in the Whitman family, perhaps as the youngest child, who had been especially beloved, or as a child whose death had come at a particularly difficult time for the family. Dr. Morrison discovered that the Whitman family had displayed Emma's memorial portrait prominently in their front parlor, where visitors would have seen it immediately upon entering the house. This placement served multiple purposes. It honored Emma's memory, demonstrated the family's grief and love, and provided a conversation starter that allowed visitors to acknowledge the loss and offer support to the surviving family members. The portrait also served important functions for the surviving children, Mary and Samuel, who would have been dealing with their own grief and confusion about their sister's death. Having a portrait that showed all three siblings together provided visual evidence that Emma remained part of their family, even though she was no longer physically present. Contemporary advice literature for grieving families, published in magazines and religious texts of the era, had encouraged the creation of such memorial portraits as healthy ways of processing grief and maintaining family bonds. The investment of time and money in creating elaborate memorial photographs was viewed as evidence of proper family values and appropriate mourning behavior. The Whitman memorial portrait had also served practical purposes in an era when extended families were often separated by great distances. The photograph could be reproduced and sent to relatives in other states, ensuring that Emma's memory would be preserved among family members who might never have met her, but who needed to understand their connection to her as part of the larger family history. Most importantly, the portrait represented the family's refusal to allow death to completely disrupt their family identity, maintaining the fiction that all three children were still together even as they acknowledged the reality of Emma's loss. Dr. Morrison's investigation reached its climax when she discovered additional documentation that definitively confirmed which of the Whitman children had died and provided new insights into the family's response to their tragedy. This evidence transformed her understanding of the memorial portrait from educated speculation into documented historical fact. The breakthrough came when Dr. Morrison located the personal papers of Albert Muller, the photographer who had created the Whitman portrait. Muller's descendants had donated his complete business archives to the German-American Heritage Museum in Cedar Rapids, where they had remained largely unexamined by researchers. Among Muller's papers, Dr. Morrison found a detailed letter that Muller had written to his brother in Germany, describing his work with the Whitman family and the technical challenges involved in creating their memorial portrait. The letter, dated October 1878, provided explicit confirmation that Emma had been the deceased child and offered unprecedented insight into the family's grief. The loss of the youngest child has devastated this family. Muller had written in German, "The mother cannot bear to look upon the child's body, yet she insists that Emma must appear in the family portrait alongside her brother and sister. I have never undertaken such technically demanding work, but the family's grief compels me to attempt what they ask." Muller's letter went on to describe the specific photographic techniques he had employed to create the composite portrait, including his use of multiple exposures and careful lighting to ensure that Emma's post-mortem photograph would blend seamlessly with the later portrait of Mary and Samuel. His description provided Dr. Morrison with definitive proof of how the memorial portrait had been created. Even more significantly, Muller's papers included a follow-up letter written to the Whitman family several months after the portrait's completion. In this letter, Muller had expressed his satisfaction with the finished work and his hope that it would provide comfort to the grieving family. Sarah Whitman's reply, preserved with Muller's correspondence, provided insight into the portrait's impact on the family. "Your wonderful work has given us such comfort," Sarah Whitman had written. "When visitors see our family portrait, they remark upon how peaceful and happy all three of our children appear. Emma looks as though she is simply resting, and we can almost imagine that she might open her eyes and smile at us again. Mary and Samuel treasure the portrait and often speak to Emma's image as though she were still with us." This correspondence confirmed that the memorial portrait had achieved its intended purpose of providing emotional comfort to the grieving family while preserving Emma's place within the family structure. The technical success of Muller's work had created a convincing illusion that all three children were present together, allowing the family to maintain their emotional connection to Emma. More than 140 years after it was created, the Whitman family memorial portrait continues to serve as a powerful testament to the lengths that grieving families would go to preserve the memory of lost loved ones and maintain family bonds that transcended death. Dr. Morrison's investigation had transformed a simple historical photograph into a window into the complex emotional and social worlds of 19th century American families. The portrait's significance extended beyond the Whitman family's personal tragedy to represent broader themes about how Americans in the 1870s understood death, family, and the power of photography to preserve relationships. In an era when death was an omnipresent reality, families like the Whitmans had developed sophisticated strategies for integrating loss into their ongoing family narratives. The technical expertise demonstrated by photographer Albert Muller in creating the composite portrait represented the intersection of artistic skill, technological innovation, and profound human compassion. His ability to seamlessly blend post-mortem and living subjects into a single convincing image provided grieving families with a form of comfort that would have been impossible without photography. Dr. Morrison's research had also revealed the broader community context that supported families during times of loss. The Cedar County farming community's collective response to the 1878 epidemic, including financial support for memorial photography, demonstrated how rural American communities had developed systems of mutual support that helped families cope with tragedy. The preservation of the Whitman portrait in historical archives ensured that Emma's memory would survive not just within her immediate family, but as part of the broader historical record of American family life. Future researchers would be able to use the portrait and its associated documentation to understand how 19th century families dealt with child mortality and used emerging technologies to maintain emotional connections with deceased loved ones. The portrait has become a valuable educational tool for understanding Victorian era mourning practices and the evolution of photography as both an artistic medium and a tool for social and emotional purposes. Museums and historical societies have used the image to help modern audiences understand the realities of life in 19th century America, where death was far more present and families had to develop different strategies for coping with loss. Perhaps most importantly, the Whitman Memorial Portrait serves as a reminder of the universal human desire to preserve relationships and maintain connections with loved ones even after death. The family's willingness to invest significant resources in creating an elaborate memorial photograph demonstrates that the bonds of love and family transcend the physical limitations of mortality. Today, as Dr. Morrison's research has shown, the portrait that initially appeared to show 3 living children actually represents one of the most sophisticated examples of 19th century memorial photography, preserving not just Emma's image, but also the enduring love of a family that refused to let death completely separate them from their beloved daughter and sister. The photograph that seemed harmless at first glance actually contained one of history's most poignant examples of how technology, artistry, and love could combine to preserve what death had taken away.